What's up everyone and welcome back to the World History Channel. Before we begin, please hit the subscribe button today. Let's get started. The Holy Grail's untold story. The Holy Grail is perhaps the most well-known of all the holy relics associated with Jesus Christ's life because of a number of films, including Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade and Monty Python and the Holy Grail, as well as literature, including medieval epic romances, The Once and Future King, and the Da Vinci Code. The pursuit of this holy object is so deeply ingrained in the public consciousness that the term Grail has come to refer to any item that requires arduous effort. You might be looking for the ultimate Funko Pop. Okay, it's not quite a miraculous cup that could give you immortal youth and healing. We all have preferences. However, what exactly is known about the Holy Grail? Is it based on stories about King Arthur or the Bible? Is it a cup at all? Is it true? Where would you go to look for it? Continue reading if answering those questions is your personal grail, so that you can fulfill your own quest and ascend to heaven like Sir Galahad. The Holy Grail's historical context in the Bible. You probably already know the basic story about the Holy Grail. It was the cup that Jesus used at the Last Supper to tell his disciples to drink a little wine but not think of it as his blood, which is disgusting. According to New Advent, later, one of Jesus' followers named Joseph of Arimathea used the cup to catch Jesus' actual blood from the cross, ensuring it became a relic of unimaginable holy power. The holy cup is then transported by Joseph to England for some reason, where it would become the object of a great deal of chivalric lust. If you only have a passing familiarity with the Gospels, you might mistakenly believe that some or all of that is in the Bible. In point of fact, the Gospels merely mention that Jesus used a cup at the Last Supper without drawing particular attention to it. Also, there is no mention of Joseph catching Christ's blood in the cup during the crucifixion. In point of fact, the only thing we know about Joseph of Arimathea is that he was a member of the Jewish High Council and a devoted follower of Jesus. After Jesus was crucified, he offered his own tomb as a place for him to die. Definitely no record of him hopping a plane for London. The Middle Ages are where pretty much everything we know about the Holy Grail first appears. The Holy Grail quest gets underway. The poem Perceval, Le Conte du Graal or Percival, the story of the Grail, written by Chrétien de Troyes in the 12th century, is where the Grail first appears. According to the Encyclopaedia Britannica, Chrétien was one of the earliest and most influential authors of Arthurian legends, and Perceval is one of the most important, despite not being finished. The relevant portion of the poem features our hero Percival inside the magical home of the Fisher King, where he witnesses a spectacular event. A parade of youths enter the dining hall, each carrying some miraculous item during the various courses of the meal. A boy carries a blood-stained spear, 2 more boys bring in candelabras, and a maiden brings in a gold and jewel-studded grail that lights up the entire room. It turns out that the fancy glowing cup only contains 1 communion wafer, which is the miraculous food for the Fisher King's father, and the only thing he has eaten in the past 12 years. Notably, the Grail in this story is called a Grail and not the Grail, and it's definitely never called the Holy Grail or related to the Last Supper at all. You are asking the appropriate question if you are wondering why it was used to serve food rather than beverages. What is a Grail exactly? Not only is Perceval's Grail not the Holy Grail, but it is also not even a cup, let alone Jesus' cup. The readers of Chrétien's poem might have expected a fish or an eel to be served on this wide, shallow serving bowl. Before the twist that it was a single communion wafer is probably not as surprising now as it would have been 900 years ago. The fact that the online etymology dictionary reveals the word Grail's origin kind of hints at that fact. Like the title of Chrétien's poem, the Old French word Graal is the source of the English word Grail. The late Latin word Gradalis is the source of the word Graal. This is probably a mistranslation of the form Kratalis, which comes from the Greek word krater and is actually a bowl used to mix wine rather than a cup. As you can see, the word Grail doesn't even have the meaning cup in its earliest form. Therefore, it is not surprising that it would take some time for the concept of the Grail as Jesus' final cup to become solidified. Strangely, some authors believed that the Grail was not even a serving vessel at all. More on that later. The Holy Grail receives the notion that the Grail is Christ's holy chalice, which Joseph of Arimathea brought to Europe, comes from where? The plot began to take shape shortly after Chrétien's Perceval. Robert de Boron was one of the authors who picked up where Crétin left off with his unfinished poem. About a decade after Perceval, de Boron wrote a work called Joseph d'Arimathie. You can get extra points for guessing the translation of that title. According to Timeless Myths, this verse romance retells the story of Jesus' final days, adding some details from common folklore, like the story of Veronica, the woman who gave Jesus a cloth to wipe his face on the way to the cross, which became a well-known relic known as the Veil of Veronica. This version says that when Christ was moving his body into the tomb, Joseph used the cup from the Last Supper to catch his blood. Joseph was arrested on suspicion of stealing Jesus' body when it vanished because, well, you know what happened. He was in prison for many years. Fortunately, Jesus appeared to him and presented him with the Holy Grail, which provided him with sustenance until Vespasian, the emperor, released him. Following this, Joseph relocated his family to the west, where he established a line of Holy Grail guardians that included Percival, the enigmatic Fisher King, guardian of the Holy Grail, the mysterious Fisher King, a wounded monarch surrounded by a vast wasteland, and the last in a long line of Grail protectors descended from Joseph of Arimathea, is central to the Holy Grail legend. There are many different versions of the Fisher King's story, just like there are many different versions of everything Arthurian. The version that Mysterious Universe says is probably the most well-known is one in which a knight named Balin stabs the king in the downstairs area with a spear of destiny in a move that became known as the Dolorous Stroke. The king is left unable to do anything but fish idly in the river outside his castle because the wound brings with it a terrible curse that transforms the kingdom around it into a wasteland. Aside from that, he essentially waits for a hero who can claim the Holy Grail and restore both himself and his ailing land. This is where Percival falls short because he doesn't ask the right questions about the Grail. Fortunately, later versions of the story would provide answers to these questions. The mysterious Fisher King has managed to pique the interest of a variety of creative types, inspiring works like T.S. The Waste Land, Eliot's seminal modernist poem, to Terry Gilliam's 1991 buddy comedy The Fisher King starring Robin Williams and Jeff Bridges, and Bran Stark in Game of Thrones. The Holy Grail quest comes to us somewhat if you knew a little bit about the Knights of the Round Table and were asked which knight found the Holy Grail. You might say Lancelot, Arthur's greatest knight. However, if you actually paid attention in English class, you would know that Lancelot did not win the Grail because he was the Queen's sideshow. Instead, his vassal son Galahad is the one who finds the Holy Grail, heals the Fisher King, restores the wasteland, and then ascends to heaven, just like Brian O'Connor did at the end of Furious 7 according to the appropriately titled Lancelot Grail Project, a cycle of prose romances from France in the 13th century that included this well-known version of the story, as well as Galahad himself, were added to the Arthurian mythos. These works were either referred to as the Vulgate Cycle or the Lancelot Grail. Even though the Holy Grail is still described as a bowl, the Vulgate Cycle's version of the story of the Holy Grail draws inspiration from Robert de Boron and Crétin de Troyes. It also downplays Percival's role to emphasize Galahad, the chosen one who is the only one who can sit in the Siege Perilous, also known as the Danger Chair, and who makes his own adulterous father look like a scrub. The Holy Grail emerges as a symbol of divine grace that can only be attained by the most pure of people in this version of the story. Was the Holy Grail discovered by Harry Potter? Even though it is sometimes still depicted as a dish rather than a cup, the idea of the Holy Grail as a serving vessel present at the Last Supper, and used to catch the blood of Christ is pretty well established at this point in Arthurian lore. Thomas Malory's Le Morte d'Arthur, arguably the most well-known Arthurian cycle adaptation and the source of tea, was heavily influenced by the Vulgate Cycle, The Once and Future King by White and a lot of other adaptations. However, a well-known Arthurian work defied conventional wisdom and asked, what if it's actually a rock? Instead of interpreting the Holy Grail as Jesus' final cup. Wolfram von Eschenbach's 13th-century poem Parzival is an epic German version of Crétin de Troyes Perceval, according to Jones's Celtic Encyclopedia. It manages to complete the story of Percival healing the wasteland and becoming the new Grail King and adds a lot of its own details. Specifically, the lapsit exilis, a stone from Lucifer's crown, is what Eschenbach refers to as the Grail. This is a different name for the Philosopher's Stone, which Voldemort wanted badly and was an alchemical substance that made you immortal. In addition, Eschenbach's Parzival is the first work to link the Holy Grail to the Knights Templar. What exactly is the Holy Grail? At this point, the Holy Grail is pretty much ingrained in Christian imagery and lore. It can be represented as a serving tray containing a wafer from Holy Communion, a cup containing two different versions of Christ's blood, or a jewel from Satan's crown that can grant you eternal life. Despite everything, there are hints in the Grail legend that the story of this miraculous vessel may have been influenced in some way by Celtic myth from before Christianity. Notably, the Fisher King shares more than a passing resemblance with the Celtic god King Bran the Blessed, who plays a significant role in the Mabinogion cycle of medieval Welsh legends. In addition to having a spear wound on his leg, Bran also possesses a miraculous cauldron that he can use to bring the dead back to life and grant wisdom. According to the legend of King Arthur, Bran, or rather his magically severed head, becomes a character in Arthur's story as well. Some people contend that Robert de Boron's Grail King Bran is based on Bran. However, despite these parallels and the prevalence of cauldrons in Celtic myth, not all scholars are convinced that the Holy Grail has Celtic roots, arguing that the imagery associated with the Grail is solely Christian. However, the similarities that Bran and Bran share are pretty hard to ignore. The fake Holy Grail of Da Vinci. We've looked at the possibility that the Holy Grail is a magic rock that grants immortality or a cup or bowl up until this point. However, some punk rock intellectual rebels have dared to ask, what if the Grail isn't an object at all? What if it's a human being? What if there are many people? This idea dates back to the 15th century, when English writer John Harding presumably got really high and asked, "Whoa man, what if sang real old French for Holy Grail wasn't Sangreal but Sangreal, which is royal blood?" Their voice implied a cool sunglasses emoji. A whole cottage industry has sprung up around the idea that the Sangreal is actually the secret bloodline of Jesus and his secret wife, Mary Magdalene, rather than a blessed relic from the Last Supper. Remember that it was just a grail before it became holy. According to Salon, this was the premise of the non-fiction bestseller Holy Blood, Holy Grail, which was a bestseller in the early 1980s, as well as perhaps more famously, Dan Brown's The Da Vinci Code, a cultural phenomenon that ripped it off in the early 2000s. As if that weren't bad enough, this theory is already based on shaky ground because it ignores the Grail's literary origin, Holy Blood, and Brown pile on layers of made-up history to support their theory. The plot to steal the Holy Grail, leaving aside the fact that the idea of the Holy Grail actually being a descendant of Jesus is very similar to someone saying, yes, lightsabers were real and also Abraham Lincoln was killed by one. And actually the lightsaber was a person. John Wilkes Booth was a secret descendant of Socrates whose family was protected by SEAL Team 6. Some of the conspiracy theories behind the Holy Grail necessitate a serious misinterpretation of historical events. History asserts that various authors have implicated the Knights Templar in conspiracy theories regarding the Holy Grail in response to the mention in Eschenbach's Parzival of a military order known as the Templies that aids in protecting the Holy Grail. There is admittedly some mystery surrounding the Templars' secret initiation ceremony. However, there is no historical evidence linking them to any non-fictional Grail quest. Templars have been said to be the protectors of the Holy Grail, whether it be via bloodline, cup, or just secret knowledge. Further complications involving Gnostic Christian movements like the Cathars are based on the existence of the Hoax secret society, the Priory of Shaun, which results in the kinds of theories that make Salon consider Holy Blood, Holy Grail to be a masterpiece in terms of huge crocs of nonsense. Other Gnostic Christian movements like the Cathars are also affected by this. In addition, claiming that Da Vinci hid information about it in his artwork is analogous to claiming that Shepard Fairey's portrait of Obama contains secret information about the existence of lightsabers. There are so many holy relics to see it's much simpler to accept the idea that Jesus once used a cup instead of the Holy Grail as the Arthurian artifact protected by the Knights Templar or Joseph of Arimathea's family. Consequently, a number of locations claim to have in their possession the Holy Chalice as distinct from the somewhat more loaded term Grail that you can go visit if you are so inclined. In 2018, two historians made the claim that they had discovered the genuine Holy Grail in the Basilica of San Isidoro in Leon, Spain. The much-beloved cup has been known for centuries as the chalice of the Infanta Doa Urraca. They use found manuscripts to support their claim that the cup was brought to Spain from the Holy Land via Egypt. However, the Cathedral of San Lorenzo in Genoa, Italy, whose Sacro Catino they claimed to be Jesus's from the Last Supper and were saved during the Crusades, would likely refute their claim. In the meantime, according to Atlas Obscura, the Chapel of the Holy Grail in Valencia, Spain, asserts that St. Peter himself, and the so-called Nantios cup in the National Library of Wales has a long reputation of being the Holy Grail due to alleged healing powers. Naturally, there are numerous other candidates. Where should you begin your search for the Holy Grail? If, however, you believe that the Holy Grail is real but that none of those contenders resemble the simple cup of a carpenter that Indiana Jones was looking for, there are some potential locations associated with the Grail where you could start your own search. According to Robert de Boron, Joseph of Arimathea delivered the Grail to the valleys of Avalon, a location which since the 12th century has been associated with Glastonbury in Somerset, England. There is even a legend that says the spot where Joseph dug his staff into the ground is where the first of the well-known Glastonbury thorn trees grew. Allegedly, Joseph's grave can be found in Glastonbury as well, so it seems like a logical spot to begin your personal quest. Since the early 20th century, people have believed that the Grail could be found at the Cathar Castle known as the Château de Montségur, which is thought to be the Grail castle from Eschenbach's Parzival. This belief stems from conspiracy theories that link the Cathars to the Grail. Richard Wagner, who went there to study the Grail for his opera Parsifal, and Heinrich Himmler, who sent some spooky Nazi boys in the hope that they could win the war with Jesus' magic cup, are notable individuals who were convinced of this. However, if you'd rather travel to Scotland, head to Rosslyn Chapel, where it is said that the walls contain the Templars' secret treasures, including a mostly fictional cup. The story, however, did not end with medieval poetry or sacred bowls that shone at feasts lit by candles, as with any good religious relic. As new authors, thinkers, mystics, and conspiracy theorists added layers of symbolism, mysticism, and outright invention to the story, the Holy Grail began to develop in increasingly bizarre directions. The Grail evolved into more than just a miraculous cup. Depending on who you asked, it became a spiritual Rorschach test that represented everything from divine truth to royal bloodlines to alien technology. Consider the Lancelot Grail cycle, also known as the Vulgate cycle, a collection of prose romances written in Old French in the early 13th century that significantly expanded the Grail legend. The story of Galahad, the perfect knight that Lancelot and Elaine created through potion-based trickery of the medieval era, takes center stage here. Galahad was not only virtuous. He was also so pure that he could wield a magical sword, see the Grail in its true form, and completely transcend this world. You would think that would be sufficient. However, the Grail continued to change. In some later versions, the Holy Grail was no longer just a symbol of Christ's death and resurrection. Rather, it was a mysterious object that was given power by angels and vanished into heaven after Galahad was ascensioned. Or it might have been hidden away in a secret monastery. Or laid to rest in Glastonbury, or confined by Templars, or awaiting discovery beneath a Rosslyn chapel that has fallen into disrepair. In a nutshell, the Grail was the first MacGuffin, a spiritual object so mysterious and awe-inspiring that everyone, from the Vatican to your Uncle Jerry, thought they might know where it was. Even King Arthur was said to have devoted his entire reign to the search for the Holy Grail, despite the irony that he never went out and found it. As people became more interested in telescopes, the scientific method, and coffee by the time we reached the Renaissance and Enlightenment periods, there was less interest in the Holy Grail. However, the Holy Grail never truly vanished. The Holy Grail experienced a significant cultural resurgence in the 19th century, as Romanticism revived interest in chivalry and ancient myth. The Grail was reimagined as a symbol of longing and sorrow by artists and poets, as a symbol of lost quests and unfulfilled dreams. For instance, the Grail was portrayed in Richard Wagner's 1882 opera Parsifal as a mystical power source ruled by a secretive monastic brotherhood. In this version of the Grail, drinking wine was less important than connecting with the divine essence of life itself. The Grail was ripe for reinterpretation by occultists and fringe historians in the 20th century. The 1982 pseudo-history Holy Blood, Holy Grail proposed that the Holy Grail was actually a symbol for the bloodline of Jesus and Mary Magdalene, making it perhaps the most influential and controversial reimagining. This theory proposes that the medieval term sang real actually referred to sang real or royal blood, rather than sang Grail or Holy Grail. The authors asserted that Jesus and Mary had children, that the Merovingian dynasty of France was formed by their heirs, and that secret societies such as the Knights Templar and the Priory of Chauen were established to safeguard this sacred lineage. Enter Dan Brown's The Da Vinci Code. It was a crazy idea with little to no real proof, but it caught the public's attention like a lightning bolt. Brown's book turbocharged Grail lore for a new generation by combining medieval myth, church politics, Renaissance art, and secret societies into a pulpy, page-turning cocktail, regardless of whether you love it or hate it. The big reveal in this version of the story is that the Grail is actually Mary Magdalene's womb, which is the vessel of Christ's bloodline. It has been hidden in plain sight, waiting for a clever symbologist and his attractive French companion to find it. Although, to put it mildly, the Da Vinci Code is far from historically accurate.